Chapter 32: Winning a War, Losing a Peace. When the United States entered World War I in April 1917, its allies had almost lost. The Europeans were fighting their land war in a new way. No one had ever seen trench warfare like this before. As with the American Civil War, when World War I broke out in 1914, generals on both sides, Germany and France, had plans that they thought would provide a knockout blow to end the war in a hurry. But the new automatic weapons were devastating against attackers. The advantages for the defense had increased so much that both armies immediately went on the defensive. And so it became stationary warfare. Both armies dug their trenches, lived underground, and fired at each other from fixed positions. For 3.5 years, the trenches stretched from the Swiss border to the North Sea. The battle lines hardly moved. On both sides, the trenches became elaborate systems. There was usually a line of front trenches. These served as outposts. Networks of supply and command trenches sometimes stretched back behind them as far as 5 miles. Complicated tunnels and sometimes even specially designed railways often connected these backline trenches. Soldiers became human moles. They hid by day and dug by night. As soon as darkness fell, they went to work, digging new trenches, stringing barbed wire, and connecting telephone lines. Instead of the higher officers leading their men into battle, the officers often stayed far back in command posts, located in comfortable chateaus. Men in the front trenches suffered terrible feelings of isolation. Not only did enemy gunfire threaten them, but darkness, cold, and mud plagued them as well. New ailments arose out of the filth and fatigue. These came to be called trench fever, trench foot, and trench mouth. In this new kind of warfare, a battle took place when large numbers of men from one set of trenches rushed out and tried to break through the enemy's trenches. The attackers always hoped they might be able to force a big enough gap that additional troops from their side could pour through and attack the entire enemy line from the rear. But attacking soldiers usually entangled themselves in barbed wire, and the defenders then mowed them down with deadly machine gun fire. In the opening battles of 1914, even before they had dug trenches, each side lost 500,000 men. That was more men than had been in the entire German army only 50 years before. Then during the whole year of 1915, the British and French did not advance more than 3 miles at any point. Still, the French lost nearly 1.5 million men in 1915, and 1 million more in 1916. At the Battle of the Somme alone, the Germans lost more men than were killed during the entire 4 years of the American Civil War. Never before had so many men been slaughtered so rapidly or so senselessly. Before the war was over, 10 million soldiers and another 10 million civilians had died, whether from bullets, disease, starvation, or the revolutions that grew out of the war. When the United States finally plunged in, both sides were weary and sick of the bloodshed. In May 1918, the Germans had pushed their trenches to within 50 miles of Paris. They aimed at all costs to reach Paris and so force the surrender of the Allies before American troops could make a difference. But the Americans came just in time. In July of 1918, 85,000 Americans arrived to help save Paris and to join a new counter-offensive. By August, an American army of 500,000 men under the command of General John J. Pershing advanced against the Germans. Before the end of September, 1.25 million Americans were fighting in France. After a bloody battle in October, the Americans advanced to Sedan, 50 miles beyond, or behind, the trenches that the Germans had held for 3 years. The Americans then cut the railroad line that had supplied the German army, and the entire German defense disintegrated. With this American encouragement, the French and British began to advance as well. The German generals and the German emperor had badly miscalculated. They had thought they would win the war before the United States came in. They could not imagine that American help at the last moment could possibly turn the tide. Though the Americans arrived late in the battle, they actually made the difference that decided the war. The United States lost 50,000 280 men in action. That bloodiest war yet in history ended with the armistice on November 11, 1918. In New York, San Francisco, Dallas, Chicago, and Atlanta, Americans danced in the streets. The Germans agreed to an armistice in November. They thought their opponents would base the final peace agreement on Wilson's generous 14 points. When President Wilson decided to go to the peace conference in Paris himself, he gave ammunition to his American critics. No president of the United States had ever before gone to Europe while he was president. Wilson's critics said he was more anxious to be the preacher to the world than to be the protector of the United States. In Paris, the three Allied leaders whom Wilson had to bargain with, the prime ministers of Great Britain, France, and Italy, were clever and tough. Each of them remembered the enormous cost of the war to his country during the 4 bloody years. Each wanted to get as much as possible in land, wealth, and power for his own country, and each hoped to punish his enemies so they would never rise again. The American president, who said he was concerned about all mankind, irritated these leaders. They compared the points that Wilson had announced from Washington with the commandments Moses received on Mount Sinai. "Mr. Wilson bores me with his 14 points," the French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau sneered. "Why, God Almighty has only 10. The treaty that came out of the Paris conference rooms was not as selfish or as vengeful as the European leaders wanted, nor was it nearly as just and noble as President Wilson had hoped. Each victorious power got territories it had been promised in secret treaties. The Allies parceled out among themselves various German colonies. At the same time, they created some new, smaller republics like Czechoslovakia and Poland, so that the people inside could govern themselves. But some of the provisions of the agreement were poisonous for the future of Europe. These provisions had to do with reparations, payments the Allies demanded from Germany to repair all the war damage. When the Germans signed the armistice, the agreement to discuss a final peace treaty, they understood they might have to pay for damage to civilians. But the British and French raised the charge for damages to include the total cost of the war to all the Allies. This meant not only the destroyed homes, farms, and factories, but also the cost of guns and ammunition. The uniforms and pay for soldiers, and even the pensions to wounded Allied soldiers and their relatives. This sum was so large and so hard to estimate that the Allies refused to name a figure or even to name a time in the future when the Germans would be allowed to stop paying. President Wilson did manage to get his scheme for permanent peace, the League of Nations, put in the same package with all those things the other Allied powers wanted. He believed that, even if the whole treaty was not perfect, his new League of Nations could correct the mistakes later. When President Wilson returned to the United States, people greeted him like a returning hero. An escort of festive warships accompanied him into New York Harbor. 10,000 people welcomed him at the Union Station in Washington. But his triumph was short. Now his political mistakes came home to roost. When Wilson had appointed the American Peace Commissioners to go to Paris, he snubbed both the Republican Party and the Senate. Yet the Republicans held the majority in the Senate, and before any treaty became law, the Constitution required the Senate to approve it by a 2/3 majority. President Wilson simply could not believe that there were reasons why any sensible Americans might not want to approve his treaty. The plan for a League of Nations, and especially Article 10, frightened Americans. Wilson said that Article 10 was the heart of the whole League, and that the League was the heart of the treaty. In Article 10, each League member promised to respect and preserve all the other members of the League against external aggression. At first sight, that looked harmless enough, but the real purpose of the article was to make each member of the League regard an attack on any other member as an attack on itself, and in that case, each League member had always to be prepared for war. If the United States were to agree to this, it would overturn one of the oldest American traditions. Should the United States let herself be required to plunge into some future European war? 2 Republican statesmen led a relentless battle against allowing the United States to join Wilson's League. One was William E. Borah, senator from the far western state of Idaho. Bora, like President Wilson, was the son of a Presbyterian minister, and Bora's father wanted him also to go into the ministry. A graduate of the University of Kansas, Bora was as eloquent as Wilson was, but he had more experience in politics. Although technically a Republican, Bora supported many Democratic measures when he happened to agree with them. He had worked for the income tax, and he had fought against trusts and monopolies. Just as Senator Bora's own personal rule in politics had been to stay independent and then support whatever measures were best, so he believed the United States should always stay independent in her relations with other countries. He bitterly opposed the idea that the United States might join the League of Nations. He was afraid it would take away the country's independence. The other leader of the anti-League forces was the learned Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts. He, too, had had a long career as a politician, but he came from a wealthy and aristocratic New England old-comer family. After attending Harvard, he wrote many books on American history. At the time of World War I, he was chairman of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, which had the power to recommend to the Senate whether or not they should adopt the treaty. Unlike Senator Bora, Lodge was a man of strong personal hatreds. He distrusted Woodrow Wilson, and so he feared Wilson's League. Then President Wilson made a fatal decision. He decided to appeal directly to the American people. In early September 1919, though already in ill health, he traveled 8,000 miles. He visited 29 cities and gave 40 speeches in 22 days. At Pueblo, Colorado, he collapsed. He was then taken back to the White House. For nearly 8 months, Wilson could not even meet with his cabinet. His wife carried messages back and forth from everybody else to the president, and from the president to them. It was never quite clear which messages actually reached him. Before the election of 1920, Wilson made one more grave political blunder. If he had been willing to work with Senator Lodge, he might still have found some compromise and might have passed the treaty and the League through the Senate, but instead, Wilson became a preacher once more. "Shall we or shall we not," he asked, "redeem the great moral obligation of the United States?" He declared that the presidential election of 1920 would be a solemn national referendum on the League of Nations. The Democratic candidate for president, Governor James M. Cox of Ohio, stood up for the League. The weak but likable Republican candidate, Senator Warren G. Harding of Ohio, opposed the League and said vaguely that he favored some sort of association of nations. Americans chose the Republican Harding by a resounding majority of 7 million votes. The United States never joined Wilson's League of Nations. Wilson was saddened that the American people chose a barren independence, but he did not give up hope that what a union of states had accomplished in North America, a union of nations might someday accomplish for the whole world.